千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Daodejing by Lao Zi. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now. To be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process of the Tao. Now, I believe we are ready to get into chapter 72. Here is the chapter title. Chapter 72, Fearing Force. What does that mean? And what is the original? As you can see, 3 characters as always. Wei, Zhang. So the first 2 characters have the same sound in different pitch. The first character, Wei, is to be fearful or afraid of something. Wei, the character in the middle, the second character, means force or power. Specifically in this context, it means the negative kind of power, the power of oppression. So what does it mean to be fearful of power? Well, this chapter is about a common pattern for humanity. It is a pattern that manifests throughout human history in the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires. It is also a pattern that can be seen every day, frequently in human interactions, in daily lives. So I'm going to explain exactly what that means. For now, let's take a look at the chapter itself. Daodejing, chapter 72. When people no longer fear force, they bring about greater force. Do not limit their place. Do not reject their livelihood. Because the ruler does not reject them, therefore they do not reject the ruler. Therefore, the sages know themselves, but do not glorify themselves, respect themselves, but do not praise themselves. Thus, they discard that and take this. So what does that suggest to us? In the last part of it, we talk about the sages not glorifying themselves or praising themselves. This is a reiteration and a continuation on the theme of humility that we have already seen in previous chapters. Now, the first part of it, we're going to understand the lines ahead of that and work our way to it. And we begin with a pattern analysis, the sectional analysis that is based on repeating characters. So when I'm looking at the first couple of lines, the only 2 characters that repeat is the last character, the 4th character from line 1, which is repeated in the 3rd character of line 2. And that's the character for force, Wei. Now, I really see the poetic iterations in line 3 and line 4, because there I not only have the same characters in the same positions of the 2 lines, like I'm showing here in the highlights. So the first character of line 3 and line 4 is repeated in the same position, the beginning position. It just means do not. By itself, it means it's a negation. It means to not have, to not do. Then we have two different characters in the second character position. Then we have the same two characters that you see there in the third and fourth position. And that's translated as there. And that's a pretty accurate translation. So we don't see the same reiteration of that pattern before or after. So that suggests that we can divide up the first two lines, the 4 characters each, they form a couplet. Then we can also see that line 3 and line 4 will be the other one. So this is the beginning of the division that we're creating for this particular chapter. So let's look down further. We see line 5 and line 6 has the same 2 characters at the end. 不厌, which means does not reject, not reject. And then we have to follow English grammar a little bit, plural or singular. So does not reject, do not reject. That's how they're translated. Now we see from line 1 to line 6 that there is a commonality of those lines, that they're all talking about the people. These lines are references to what the people do and what the ruler, how the people react to the ruler. Then starting from line 7 on to the end of this chapter, it's about the sages, what the sages do, how the sages are. And therefore, we have a dividing line here. You can see that this is a thicker dividing line because I'm trying to depict here that the first 6 lines are a thing by itself. They're all about the people, or, as I mentioned, about the people's reaction to the ruler. And then the last part of it, from line 7 to line 10, those lines are all about the sages. These are all descriptions about the sage. And let's take a look at repeating patterns there. So line 7, therefore the sages, that's the intro line for the last section. Then we have 2 lines with repeating characters in a poetic structure, poetic reiteration. And let me highlight them for you. And you can see 3 repeating characters there. And they are translated as, the first one is themselves, and then do not themselves. So basically 3 characters. You can see the first character and the fourth character is the same. That's the self character. It could be oneself, myself, yourself, themselves. And then we have 不, character in the middle. That's the character for not. So this will become clear when we go through the lines one by one. Just like chapter 71, each one of these lines and the lines together have deeper layers of meaning. And my intention today is to explain exactly how the multiple layers of meaning are derived. With the same insight that we go over today, you can see the rest of the Daodejing in a completely new way, knowing that every chapter of the Daodejing becomes essentially 3 replicates, 3 copies, each one addressing a different aspect of life. So we're going to get to that. We'll work our way into that understanding. First, we're going to begin line by line analysis with the first 2 lines. First, we'll talk about this character, Wei. So it's easy, W-E-I, Wei, but the pitch is a little more difficult for a non-native Chinese speaker because in English, the pitch depends on the place of a word in a sentence, whereas in Chinese, its sing-song quality comes from the different pitch of different characters. This one is Wei, whereas the fear is Wei. So it's hard for English speakers to hear the difference between the two. Wei, Wei. And the meaning for this particular character is might, power, force. Now, in different contexts, it means different things. In the context of the first line, line 1, the power, the might, the force is the oppressive force of a tyrant, the dictator. Okay, and then in line 2, same character, Wei, might, power, force. This time, nothing to do with the oppressive force of tyranny. Rather, it is the power that reacts to the tyrant, the power of the people rising up against tyranny. It's the counter force. It's the power to counter the power of the tyrant. So is it good? Is it bad? Well, it depends on the context. The first one, Wei, in line 1, it is the same usage as the title, the Chinese title that we talked about. That's a negative context. It's negative or bad from the perspective of the oppressed, of the people. It is, of course, personally beneficial to the oppressor. So from that perspective, they might think of it as good. They may justify it by saying that, oh yeah, there's heavy-handed rule, there's oppression for the people, but they have stability and security. Perhaps that is the excuse or the justification for oppressive tyranny. Then, in the second instance of that, Wei, that is the revolution. That's rebelling against, that's the power of the rebels in fighting against tyranny. So we'll talk more about that momentarily. So let's take a look at line 1. When people no longer fear force. So this is actually what the chapter is talking about. What happens when people no longer fear force? So let's run through the sequence. Let's go through the pattern of what usually happens. First, tyrants rule by oppressing people. I think everybody is like, yes, that's we know that's the definition of tyranny. So that's pretty obvious. Let's continue on. We know that initially people put up with it because people try to tolerate the oppression. Most of the time, people don't want to cause a problem. They don't want to rock the boat, upset the status quo. But there's a limit to everybody. There is a limit to the tolerance of the people against oppression. The tools of the tyrants would be fear, intimidation, punishment, or the threat of punishment, the threat of violence, death, pain, like torture. So the ruler eventually will push the people too far. And if pushed too far, the people become willing to die in opposition to the oppressive ruler. We've seen this many, many times in history. A common pattern, historical common pattern, as I mentioned before. So the threats of death, of punishment, intimidation, those threats have become ineffective. People no longer fear them. The oppression has become greater than the natural fear of negative consequences, and therefore the counter force that rises up is a greater power than the power of tyranny that it opposes. I think that makes sense. Now, let's continue on to line 2. Now, individually, people are no match against tyranny. And that is how tyrants can rule, is by keeping people divided. Sometimes that is done through encouraging people to report one another for infractions, for unlawful behavior. this turns the people against one another, so they cannot unite. They cannot be a unified front. Now, if they could see through that subterfuge and band together, when they're banded together, they can be much more powerful. Indeed, more powerful than the tyrant. So the ruler recognizes that this is a danger. The rebellion is something that the ruler privately fears. The oppressor fears the rebellion of the people. Rebellions can bring down an empire like a wrecking ball. So the massive uprising can topple the strongest tyrant. And haven't we all seen this play itself out throughout history? You know, either east or west, it makes no difference. It seems to be part of human nature. We see this over and over again. Now, as I mentioned when we discussed the title, these two lines applied not just to rulers and subjects, but also to everyday human interactions. Now, before we get to that, I want to explain later on how we interpret the Daodejing in 3 different levels. We're going to take a 5-minute break because we're nearing the middle part of our meeting today. We're going to take 5 minutes, and then when we come back, we will talk about the 3 different but related ways to interpret the Daodejing. So now, as I started to say, the Daodejing itself is supposed to be interpreted in 3 levels, in 3 different but related ways. Let me explain. The 3 levels of the Daodejing. At the surface level, as you can see in this chapter, in the first 2 lines, the Daodejing appears to be advice from Lao Zi to the ruler. Now, this, as I mentioned, is the surface level meaning of the lines. And some students of the Daodejing may only be aware of this level. This interpretation is consistent with Lao Tzu's historical role as a royal archivist for one of the kings during the Warring Stage period. So in the royal court, from time to time, the king might wish to consult with him because Lao Tzu was known for being wise and being very masterful with the history, with the ancient sages, the teachings from ancient sages. So these rulers from the Warring Stage periods, they were no fools. They knew that they didn't want to repeat the mistakes of history. They wanted to learn from the past. So they would come to someone like Lao Tzu and ask for advice. The king might wish to consult him and say questions like, has a situation like our current situation ever happened in the past? And if it has, what was the outcome? What were the factors? Or the king might ask Lao Tzu, there is a decision I must make. What is the Tao perspective on that? What would the ancient sage kings do? So because of this, for quite some time, and even today, Western scholars refer to the Daodejing as a political treatise. So they think at this level, level 1, advice to the ruler. And they think that is what the Daodejing is all about from beginning to end. So let me just explain for everybody that this is actually incomplete. If this is all that the Daodejing is, it would not be so popular for 2,500 years, ever since it was written. The Daodejing is read by everybody, not just kings, emperors, and rulers. Most of us will never get a chance to be a ruler like that. but we can all be rulers of our own individual private kingdoms, our lives. Therefore, the reason why we study it is because it is advice for the individual. Lao Tzu is providing you with advice as he provided the king of the warring stage period. And this is, of course, because you are the sovereign ruler of your own life. And therefore, advice to the king applies equally well to you at the personal level. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But there's more. It's not just advice to the ruler, not just advice for the individual who is the ruler of his or her own kingdom, but there's a little bit more beyond that. Notice that level 1 and 2 is all about the external world. It's about the king ruling a kingdom that exists in the material world. Number 2, level 2, is about you ruling your life, and you live your life in the material world. There's a level 3 because the Tao is concerned not just about the external world, but also the internal one. So all of the above, as I pointed out, levels 1 and 2 are concerned with the external material world. The Daodejing is equally concerned with your internal spiritual landscape. So the third level is the guidance for Dow cultivation. And this is mostly internal. It's about what happens within the heart. So this is another reason why the Daodejing has remained popular for 2,500 years, because it's not just for kings and emperors, it's for you, and it's also for your path in the Tao. And because of these 3 different levels of the Daodejing, one can think of the 81 chapters of the Daodejing as multiplied by 3. So it can be seen as 243 chapters. 81 chapters for the king, 81 chapters for the individual, and 81 chapters for Tao cultivation. So the 3 different levels, this is what I mean when I said that every line in the Daodejing has different but related interpretations. They do not lend themselves to multiple interpretations in the sense that you can explain the line in different ways that have nothing to do with one another, but when you explain the lines in different ways, they all have something to do with one another. And let me explain how that relationship works. First, let me put out a table here to show you. We have level 1, which is for the king or the emperor. We have level 2, which is for the individual. And finally, we have level 3, which is the Tao. So the Tao for the king or the emperor is about the best way to rule. And then what about for the individual? Well, it's about the journey of your life. And then lastly, with respect to the Tao, it's about the path of spiritual cultivation. Those are the 3 different levels. Let me point one thing out real quick. For the king, I say the best way to rule, emphasis on way. For the individual, the journey of your life, emphasis on journey. And then lastly, for the Tao, emphasis on the path. The Tao is the character that you see in the upper right-hand corner. That character means, as a noun, it means the way, the path, the road, the street, etc. So these are all represented by the Tao character in the upper right-hand corner. Now let's dig into this part, the 3 different divisions, starting with the top one. The best way to rule, what does that mean? Well, the Tao master would provide wise counsel to the ruler, or the ruler would study the Tao and reflect upon the best way to make decisions, the wisest governance of the people. It's all about how best to govern the subjects of the kingdom or citizens of the empire. That encapsulates the best way to rule. That's what the ancient kings wanted to learn. Now for you and for me, it's about the journey of life. We're on that journey, and the question that we have is a little bit different from the ancient kings. Rather than how to govern the subjects of a kingdom, we're interested in optimally manage the various aspects of our modern lives. And you can think of it metaphorically that, well, the modern existence that I have is like a kingdom, and the different aspects of my existence are the subjects of the kingdom. That's how they map to one another. And then what about the path of spiritual cultivation? That's different again from managing a kingdom or managing your life. Well, this level is about learning the Tao through the various activities that we engage in, whatever those may be. They can include, but they are not limited to, reading, reflections, review of your actions and words, meditations, meditative activities, etc. You can, for instance, be in a group like this, like what we're doing now. We can, for instance, discuss with like-minded individuals. And the meditative practices, there are so many different ones. There are meditative practices, meditations that are physically active, like Qigong or Tai Chi. They can be physically inactive, like sitting Zen meditation. So there are many different ways for us to follow in the path of spiritual cultivation. Now, I've filled out the left-hand side or the middle column in this table because this is all about what happens internally in the context of each row. So for the king, there's what's going on inside the kingdom. What laws do you pass? What law enforcement measures do you have? How is the society behaving itself? How are the people? Are they productive? Those are all internal considerations to the kingdom. The king or the emperor's responsibilities extend beyond what is inside the confines or the borders of the kingdom. It is also externally directed in that context, which means diplomatic relationships with other countries, other states, other nations. And this is either through diplomacy for friendly relationships, perhaps trade, commerce, and it can also be negative, like warfare. So even in regards to warfare, there are lines in the Daodejing that specifically talk about war. And the Daodejing is quite clear in saying that warfare must be the last resort. Warfare is the most horrible thing that human beings can inflict upon one another. So that right-hand column there, you can see, is externally directed in the context of that row. So what about the journey of your life? Yes, you can be running or managing your life, the various aspects of it. Those are the concerns that you have control over. And then there's also your interactions with other people, your neighbors, your friends, your relatives, family members, loved ones, your coworkers, all that, your connection with the people in your life. And this includes positive connections as well as negative connections. So you can map each one of those with the row right above, like friendly relationships with people that you help out, the people who help you. That would be like diplomatic relationships from one kingdom to another. Warfare would be the negative counterpart of that. That is, when you get into contention or conflict or just friction with other people, there's unpleasant happening, there's bad blood between two people. That's the negative part of it. And it can erupt in warfare as well. You can be fighting, arguing with somebody else. That can be part of your journey in life. And the Daodejing, in exactly the same way, would advise you that that must be the last resort. Waging personal warfare, just like a king or emperor waging war on another country, must be the last resort. Contention is the worst thing that you can get into and the worst thing that you can inflict on another human being. So those are the aspects in the journey of life. So what about when we get into what is inside the heart? What is inside the mind? What happens when we turn the gaze inward to look at ourselves within? How do we map diplomatic relationships or friendship and warfare to that context? Well, in the Tao, it is all about understanding yourself and then dealing with the conflicts that you have within. So here I say, deal with inner demons. Your inner demons may be like regrets about past events you cannot change. Obsessive thoughts or desires you cannot let go. Would those qualify as inner demons? Of course. There can also be inner conflicts. Should I do A or B? Should I take this path or that path? This looks really good, but that looks pretty good too. Should I aim for long-term benefits or maximize immediate gratification? Boy, it is so tempting. So tempting to go for the quick wins, pick the low-hanging fruits, but what would that do for the long term? Those are the kind of conflicts that we have internally all the time. And then we also have the alignment internally that we need to think about as well. There are oftentimes things that we want that one part of the mind thinks is really good, but then the alignment is not there because perhaps the spiritual self has a different idea. You may, for instance, spiritually long for peace and quiet, while at the same time, your mind may be wishing for more experience, more noise, more knowledge. The best way in the Tao is that you can utilize the Tao to bring your various aspects of the mind and spirit into alignment with one another. Another way that we can think of it is consciousness and the subconscious mind. So remember, the subconscious mind works very differently than our conscious, rational thoughts. The subconscious mind may have its own ideas, its own preferences and goals. And sometimes you don't really find them out until later on when you discover that you have sabotaged yourself. This may be because starting from a young age, we've all been conditioned. We've all received conditioning by the external world. And if you don't change or align with the subconscious mind with what you want consciously, rationally, you may revert back to what the subconscious mind is used to. More of the same, the mundane existence, what society tells you rather than what you want for yourself. And society can tell you things like, you must conform to everyone's expectations. you must, for instance, belong to a particular church because everybody in the community does. You must participate in the rat race because everybody does. So aligning what the subconscious has been conditioned to with what you have rationally figured out yourself, that will be another kind of work that happens in the path of spiritual cultivation, and it's internally directed. So let me pull back a little bit and just kind of bring about and reemphasize the fact that with the Daodejing, there are the three levels. There's the level of the king, the level of the individual, and the level of the Tao. So this can be a little bit abstract. So I want to apply the three levels to a line from the Daodejing. The first two lines of this chapter, we're going to put it through the three levels as well. But I want to demonstrate how from the very first line of the Daodejing, we already have the three levels in effect. It's just that most people don't know this. What is the first line? The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Or in Chinese, Dao ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao. This is probably the most well-known line in all of Tao teachings. So people ask, does this first line lend itself to multiple interpretations? I say yes, but not in the way that you think. It's multiple interpretations because we apply the three levels, and that will give us three different but related interpretations. Whereas when people ask multiple interpretations, what they mean is, well, you say the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, but I see another interpretation that says the way that can be walked is not the eternal way. Well, let me explain. The three levels of interpretations on this same line, none of them has anything to do with the way that can be walked. So the Tao character as a noun, it can mean path, way, it can mean road. As a verb, it can mean talk, speak, discuss, but it can never mean walk. It can never mean anything that's related to walking, anything at all. Now, I understand the confusion because to somebody who does not know Chinese, when you want to use the word for way as a verb, walk seems plausible. Like, what do you do with the path? You walk it. That's plausible. To someone who does know Chinese, there is no uncertainty. The answer is no. It doesn't mean that. And this is why I say not all interpretations are valid. Some interpretations are just incorrect. There's another translation that'll say the way that can be trodden, same thing. It's talking about the way that can be walked. So it is also wrong. The Tao, the Daodejing itself can be interpreted in three different ways, but it's the three-level structure that makes a lot of sense. And I do understand that when the language itself is not among the knowledge of the author, everything seems vague or confusing. But when you do know the language, the confusion goes away. Let me give you an example from the opposite direction. An example in our English-speaking world when a non-native speaker learns to speak English. One of the most common mistakes that many novice students make, is misunderstanding the word explain. So oftentimes, when When such a student encounters something they don't understand, they may say, please explain me. Please explain me. When they really should say, please explain it to me. As an English speaker, you know the difference between the two. But the basic point is that to the novice students of the English language, it seems plausible that the word explain by itself means to explain something. So when they say, please explain me, they're trying to say, please explain something to me. Native speakers of English know that's not the case, because we know you have to follow the verb explain with a noun, whatever it is that you want the explanation for. Explain, the word, doesn't have some kind of double meaning that can be used either way. One way is the correct usage, the other is the incorrect usage. Keep in mind this important point. English is not intentionally vague. Neither is Chinese. The real meaning and misunderstanding are not both valid. So this is just like a Western author not knowing the word Tao and doesn't know that when used as a verb cannot mean walk. There's no intentional multiple meaning. It's a plain expression with one meaning. That applies to the entirety of the Daodejing. The Daodejing itself, although oftentimes seen as vague or mysterious, the lines are actually plain expressions with clear meaning. My contribution to this world is going to be to hammer that point, to drive it home, that here, guys, we have clear, wise advice for life. Let's not try to make it distorted and mysterious. Let's understand exactly what it's trying to say. So let me use that first line to talk about how we apply the 3 levels. This, I think, will make it clear. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. So how would that apply to level 1, the best way to rule? Well, the advisor to the king who is aware of the Tao may say, Your Majesty, you must embody the Tao of leadership and not just talk about it. Why? Because the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. So what the advisor says is that, Your Majesty, don't just learn about the Tao of leadership, you must do it. You must lead in a seamless way, in a compassionate way, according to the Tao. You must not seek to be highly visible to satisfy your ego. You must begin with the welfare of the people in mind. Those are the Tao of leadership. Rather than to talk about it, you must embody those and actually put those into action. That's why the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. How would we apply the same line in level 2 to the journey of your life? This is where we would learn from Lao Tzu to be actively engaged in your own journey through life. What we're saying is that life is meant to be lived. Of course, no amount of verbal description can replace the actual experience. Life is not a travel brochure to read about. It's a journey that must be experienced. It is an experience to savor. So the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. That's what it means in the 2nd level. And finally, how would we apply that to the path of spiritual cultivation? Well, it is not enough to discuss the Tao because words are limited. One must apply the Tao in everyday life. Only by practicing the Tao can one truly master the Tao. Now you have seen how the 3 levels apply. Let's use the same understanding, the same idea, the same skill, and apply it to the first 2 lines of chapter 72. When people no longer fear force, they bring about greater force. Now you have seen at the level of the kingdom how that applies. It's about the ruler, the oppressive ruler, and the rebellion rising up against. Now, what about the personal level? You map it to the personal level, you discover this is about the bully. This is about the people who are domineering, and they use threats to get their way. That maps to the tyrant. You may, for instance, have a tyrant at work. This is the horrible boss from hell. And the horrible boss will resort to threats to get his way as well. But then one day, the bullied decide they have had enough. They no longer fear threats, the negative consequences, and they stand up against the bullying. Have we not seen that? Yes, we have seen that quite a few times. That happens because it's a pattern. It repeats itself at different levels of existence, at the kingdom level and also at the personal level. Now let's talk about the Tao level. At the internal level, this is all about suppressing a genuine need. So it's about suppression, like in the kingdom, it's about oppression. Suppressing a need, a valid, legitimate, genuine need is bad, just like oppressing the people is bad. And oftentimes, it is fear as well that plays a role. When we suppress a need that we have, oftentimes it is due to the fear of negative consequences. Let me give you an example. Perhaps as part of your personal growth, you need to become independent, strike out on your own. And I'm using these descriptions in a general way intentionally. You need to strike out on your own. You need to be independent, but you are hesitant. Why? You are suppressing the need to become independent. Why? Because of fear. Fear of failure. What if I fail? What if I fall flat on my face? What if I have to go back, humiliated due to failure? That fear keeps you from doing what you ought to do. But then one day, you decide you have had enough. You may think, well, I can't keep on living this way. You may think, if I fail, I fail. At least I will learn something. At least I will experience what it is like. Then you overcome the suppression. You realize that suppressing anything too much, and you start to get the opposite reaction, which means you bring about a greater force of motivation to overcome the suppression of the need. It's like a pendulum. When it swings too far in one direction, it will invariably reverse course and swing back in the opposite direction. So that's the personal, internal level, the Tao level of how these two lines apply. Let's go ahead and summarize. We've got the two lines there. When people no longer fear force, they bring about greater force. At the level of the king, Tao sages advocate against excessive interference with the people, apply the Wu Wei principle to governance. Wu Wei means non-attached actions, less interference. Do not interfere with the people, do not limit them, because when they no longer fear force, they bring about greater force. The way we apply that to the individual level is that in social interactions, Tao sages lead by example, they extend courtesy to all, they build positive relationships with everybody. And this is because they want to be the very opposites of the bullying, domineering behavior. They want to be the courteous ones. and they don't want to place limitations. They don't want to impose on everybody. That is the individual level. And then more importantly, the internal level of the Tao, the sages, in managing their own internal emotional states, they would make sure they know what is a need versus merely a want. They want to be clear and self-aware. They want to know themselves. And you'll see this theme repeated again later in the chapter. The sages know themselves. They understand what they need versus what they want. And I want to make sure that we have the same clarity as the sages as well, which is the reason why I want to spend a moment to talk about wants versus needs. What is a want? What is a need? Let's start with the wants first. A want is a non-essential desire. It's a nice to have rather than a must-have. And oftentimes what we find that wants are oftentimes material things. Many material things are wants rather than needs. You can do without a fancy gadget, for instance. And then we also see that when you overindulge in these non-essential desires, you can end up with negative consequences. So the better thing to do is to let go of the wants that don't actually contribute to your life. Let go of the wants that actually complicate things for you. And a characteristic of a want is that it is something you can let go of, you can discard without affecting your life in a meaningful way. So this is not to say that you need to eliminate all wants, all desires completely. What the Tao says instead is moderation. The Tao teachings recognize that occasional indulgence can be harmless. At the same time, the Tao teachings will also warn that excessive indulgence will usually be very harmful. I think that makes sense. So letting them go, there is a joy, there's a freedom in discarding excessive clutter. You free up a lot of space. You free up a lot of elbow room, breathing room, space that you can enjoy. There's a joy, and that's how you can tell if something is a want rather than a need. So let's cover the needs as well. Needs would be something essential, the essential necessities to life. Now, there are some things that we have figured out that we all need. Sometimes we try to convince ourselves that we don't need them, but we actually do. For instance, I will say that we all need purpose and meaning in life. I have seen people argue against this, like, well, what's the use? Everything is ultimately meaningless. Or who says I need a purpose? I'm just going to wander through life exactly as I am. Whenever I see that, I see the pain of emptiness that is hidden. I see people who don't like feeling the emptiness within, but intellectually they try to excuse it, they try to justify it away by using some sort of argument. And what would be another need that we all have? We all need one another. We all need connections, friendship, fellowship. It is often said that human beings are social animals. I believe that is true. We need a meeting like this to connect with one another. We need relationships that are life-affirming, that make you a better person, positive, strong relationships. So suppressing needs like these can cause huge problems, whereas letting go of a want can bring joy. To fulfill the needs is how we also bring joy into our lives. A need that is justifiable, that is something that is essential to life, is absolutely what we need to fulfill. It should be part of the purpose and the meaning that we enjoy in life. So this is only the beginning of our discussion on wants versus needs. There's more to talk about in this context, but I see that we have already gotten close to the end of the meeting today, so I'm going to jump ahead to the summary, and then we will return to this topic next time and continue talking about needs and wants. For now, let's talk about the summary. What have we talked about in chapter 72 today? Well, we have seen the importance of applying the Tao to life. We have seen the importance, for instance, to not place limits. Do not limit anyone, including yourself. Do not impose unreasonable rules on others. We were talking about tyrants and tyranny, and then we map that to real life examples of bullies and people with domineering tendencies. Those are the ones that impose unreasonable rules on other people. We don't want to be the bully. We don't want to be the ones that impose. And I said that anyone, including ourselves, correct. We don't want to limit ourselves either. This means we have some work to do to examine our own self-limiting beliefs. We will talk more about this next time. The second important thing is to embrace all. You see, the kings and the emperors not imposing tyranny on the people maps to sages and ourselves being courteous to everyone. This is an embracing of everyone. This is seeking to understand the perspective of other people around us. They may not see the world in the same way that we do, and it's a good idea to know where they're coming from. Then you must also turn your gaze inward to understand yourself. This theme here, understanding others, understanding yourself, is going to be repeated over and over again throughout the rest of this chapter, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.